Thank you for tuning in to another episode of One More Story. Just a quick programming note, parents, if you'd like to skip past the interview and go straight to the first story, you can find it at the 18-minute, 30-second mark. But the subscription option is there for you if you prefer to put on just the stories for the kids. And please be sure to leave us a review if you are enjoying the show. It helps boost our visibility on all the platforms. So sit back, relax, and enjoy tonight's episode. My guest tonight is Parisa Fitz-Henley. She is an actress and producer best known for her work in Luke Cage, Jessica Jones, Midnight Texas, and The Sinner. Parisa, welcome to the show.
Hey, Pete. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And also you're very active in the Mona Foundation. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that, the organization, and how you became involved?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The Mona Foundation is an organization that promotes education for young people throughout the world. In particular, it has a focus on empowering women and girls. Their aim is to support local organizations in the ways that they need in the localities that they're in. So the Mona Foundation is really decolonized in their approach. And I got involved with them through a friend and fell in love with what they do, and very happily have been serving with them for a few years now.
And so tell us a little bit about your path as an actor. You were born and raised in Jamaica, right?
Partly. I was completely born in Jamaica, but I was partly raised there.
Gotcha.
My father was Jamaican and my mother is American.
And I just grew up between Florida and Jamaica, back and forth.
What was that like, and what was your path to LA and the entertainment business?
So it was a really interesting experience growing up between two very different cultures and two very different parents. And I'm also biracial. So it's a lot of the feeling of being an other, but then also being able to be amongst others in ways that they could sometimes accept. So I felt I got a lot of opportunities to imagine what different people's lives were like because of that. And also really enjoyed imagining them by myself. So I would play characters in my room. I wasn't as much of a performing kid as I was an imaginative kid, super into books and creating backstories for people and playing them out in the privacy of my room. And I was finishing high school in Jamaica and got an opportunity to model and travel to different parts of the world doing that. And never imagined myself being an actor because I just thought acting is something that those other people do. It's this thing that special people do, not me. And then I got some really interesting opportunities to do it. I accidentally walked on a set where someone had accidentally hired a day player, and I fit the bill and ended up doing it and really intuitively connected. And I was living in Jamaica at that time. I started studying with a teacher there, and then eventually moved to LA to really give it a shot. And funny enough, I thought it was at the time, I believe I was 26, and I was like, gosh, maybe I'm too old to be an actor. That was 20 years ago. I learned that a lot of the myths that I'd absorbed about acting were just that: what age you're supposed to be, who can do it. And that has been a really heartwarming and humbling and encouraging experience over the years to just look at like really what it means to be an artist.
Right.
I really think everyone is.
So I'm curious because we are recording remotely and you are somewhere not in Los Angeles, but you didn't want to give away the exact location, but it's my home state. Can I say that?
Totally. You can get that close for sure.
All right. So you're somewhere in South Carolina, which is really interesting. So how are you staying? I mean, there's not a lot of work right now because of the strike, but when did you relocate? Was this a pandemic thing? And how do you stay connected to the entertainment industry, living where you live?
I didn't expect to get emotional on this, but I think I'm going to, because it's been such a journey. I came here July of the first year of the pandemic. because my parents settled in a very, very rural area near where I am. So I'm in upstate South Carolina.
Okay.
And my parents, and then my brother and his fiance and their baby, my niece, when she was born February of 2020. So
Oh, wow.
they were living in New York, and they thought, we got to get this newborn out of this hellhole.
Right.
They settled there. My parents live on 80 acres of shared property with, at the time, it was 2 sets of aunts and uncles. Recently, one of my aunts passed away. But we were able to have this year and a half of just 10 family members in this kind of small property with a pond in the middle. And it was a really beautiful experience. But it was also, being a person of color, most of my family is white. And we were in a town in which we were probably the only people of color for miles, my brother and his family and I. And it was such a politically, socially charged time.
Right.
And it made it hard to feel safe. And then also you have lots of woods there that you could just be like, well, maybe I won't do people. I'll just roam in the woods. But then there's bears. So it's just like, I need to be someplace a little bit more peopled and with maybe a little bit more diversity. And so I found a really cool little town about 25 minutes from my parents and spent some time here really feeling super disconnected from everything creative, and then left for a while right after agreeing to judge a short film competition for the South Carolina Film Commission. And that changed everything for me. I was introduced to artists all over South Carolina with so many different sensibilities, and it woke something up in me. And I thought, I can live there. I've been booking work via tape since well before the pandemic. Most of my work I was getting because I was on set somewhere else.
Right.
So I just thought, well, why don't I really lean into this? And then I finally bought a background and good lights and started to love it.
So have you now been a little bit pleasantly surprised by the South? Because I feel like, for me, the South is a complicated place, and it has a complicated history and a complicated present. But I think there's a lot of good that people don't realize down there. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. I growing up in Florida, that's very much the South, although in certain ways it's, you have so many people from other places that it can feel a little bit separate. But being in South Carolina and rural South Carolina, you never forget that you're in the South. And, there's an incredibly complicated history. I've done a lot of race relations work over the last 20 years, 25 years now, gosh. And I was doing some at the beginning of the pandemic where the only phone service I had was in the center of the little town my parents lived near, next to the Dollar General and under a Confederate flag right in front of their Confederate monument. And I just was like, what is this life? This is so interesting. And I had to really deal with the feelings, the real justified feelings of fear, but also having to learn to trust in myself and trust in my relationship to spirit, honestly, and also trust in people. And I started to really notice how beautiful the hearts of people were here. And it reminded me of something that I learned growing up, which was that a lot of people have much more developed hearts than minds. And I've just seen like people practice being loving for a long time. And, you'd see people who were on paper, in a sense, racist. And then they'd have a son or daughter marry somebody of the, of different race. And then the kids come and everything changes. All of a sudden they're like, well, not this kid though. I love this kid. Well, I love this kid's dad too. Well, and then I love his family. And then hearts start to change. But when I moved to New York when I was 19, and I noticed, there are lots of people who know how to say the right things, but no one comes to their house that doesn't look like them. They don't have any friends that don't look like them. And I started to think about the difference between the heart and the mind. And I have a lot of faith in people's hearts for changing minds, much more so than the other way around. So being in the South reminds me of possibilities, even while I still feel like I have to watch my back sometimes.
Wow. Yeah, I guess that's such a interesting way to think of it. I wasn't born there, but I moved there when I was 10. I lived in Washington, D.C. and came from a very diverse elementary school that was 20% white, 80% everything else.
Wow.
And then I moved to South Carolina, but then I got to know the people. I was fortunate to go to a really great progressive school and very open-minded, loving people. And it changed my perspective on that. And I do think you have to live in the place and actually get to know these people. And yeah, it's complicated.
You have a really interesting perspective, and getting to know people, like you said, like you have to live amongst the people. And I think once you've had even one experience like that, it makes it harder to assume things about other people anywhere. It's extremely valuable.
Yeah, I think, exposure to differences is the key to accepting differences. Because if you grow up in a place and you don't know anyone who doesn't look like you don't know anyone who has a different sexual orientation than you don't know anyone who shares different religious beliefs, you don't understand the world. And you'd be surprised that underneath all of these sort of surface differences, there are core things that we all need and want as human beings. We want safety for ourselves. We want respect, and we want to raise our children in a safe environment. And so if we can build on those things and get past all the other reasons people have for hating each other, I think we'd be in good shape. But that's a tall order, and I don't think we're going to solve it on a children's story podcast.
No, but we can chip away. I think that's all any of us can do ever, is we're just chipping away.
Yeah.
And I think it's also important to realize that we have, in addition to shared kind of loves and strengths, we have shared weaknesses.
Right.
All human beings, no matter how diverse an upbringing, no matter how much we've been oppressed, it's very easy for human beings to judge and to separate. And I mean, I just think about, I had a very humbling moment recently because, there's a lot of division going on everywhere in the world, but, there's been a lot in particular that's been in the news right now. And I'm just like, oh, my heart's breaking, and I'm trying to figure out ways to help people come together. And then I was driving towards my house and I saw the produce market that's opening up that is going to be a direct competitor of my friend's market that sells produce about a 2-minute drive away. And I looked at that produce market and I was like, I don't like them in my head. And I thought, oh my God, I don't know them.
Right.
I haven't been inside. But immediately I was like, that other one is my team and you're not on my team. You're trying to do something to my team over a produce market.
Right.
And it was a legit thought. I don't like them.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, this other market that my friend opened, I became friends with them after they opened it. It opened 2 months ago. And that's how quickly I tied myself to that market over the other market, and the words "I don't like them" came to my mind. So, I mean, we have to understand the way we operate as human beings so that we can get past it and extend grace to each other as well, because nobody's perfect.
Yeah.
Not me.
That's a valid point. So transitioning a little bit, I'm curious about your childhood, since this is a kid's bedtime story podcast. What were some of your favorite stories as a child?
God, I loved stories as a kid, all of them. I remember some of the earliest things that I read were Ezra Jack Keats books, and I loved the pictures. The pictures were so detailed, and I could imagine these worlds. And I remember seeing like a little kid in New York in this very urban environment, which I had no reference for, but it felt real to me. And as I got older, I was really attracted to real life stories. I read a book called Children's Hospital multiple times. It was about case studies of children basically living in the hospital who had very intense medical things. And I'm also super in love with medical things.
That's heavy.
It was heavy, but I loved it. I loved what I started to realize when I looked back was that I loved worlds inside of worlds. I loved The Secret Garden, that book, where, it's this whole world that is walled off from everything else and beautiful and quiet and mysterious. And I loved Jane Eyre, which I read multiple times growing up. And I loved Stephen King. It's way earlier than I was supposed to. I don't know how I got a copy of Cujo, but I remember reading it, just seeing it in my mind. And my mom found it and took it from me. And then I found it and took it back. And then she took it again. As I got a little bit older, I read It.
Oh, boy.
And it was so scary to me at night. When I was finished reading it, I would put a sweater or something over it, and then I would put a Bible or one of my Baha'i prayer books on top of it and then go to sleep because I had to contain whatever was in there. But I loved it. And I remember putting the Depeche Mode, was it Bloodletting album on? And I would listen to moody music while I was reading. And that was a fresh brain because now I cannot read and listen to music at the same time.
Right.
But loved reading, loved it. And I loved revisiting certain books.
Well, now as an adult, what's your wind down routine?
It's pretty simple. I start getting the lights down low. Actually, even when the sun starts setting, I start switching to red lights because of Andrew Huberman, the Huberman Lab guy. And it really helped me a lot because if I don't help myself go to sleep, I will stay up all night. I won't feel great about it, but I'm a recovering dawn bedtime person.
Wow.
So I knew I wanted to be an early to bed person. And so little by little, I do a lot of sleep hacks. So trying to stay off screens, cooling off the house, dimming lights. And then once I get in bed, I have a routine that includes some of the spiritual practices of the faith that I practice. That is just a kind of regular thing that just helps me to get into the spirit of going to sleep. I put in my earplugs that I wear always, no matter how quiet it is. That also just relaxes me. I put my little eye mask on my forehead, and then I read. I'll often read. I went through everything of Octavia Butler's, and I probably will again. Oh God, I love her. I love her so much. And I usually don't read a ton because I'm pretty tired and ready to go, but I'll read a little something and then drift off.
Nice. Well, are you ready to help some children drift off?
I would love it. What an honor.
The word is fire. Once upon a time, in a small village, deep in the woods, in the foothills of the mountains, lived a young girl named Mabel. And Mabel lived in a very modest earthen home. It was made of earth and stones, some thatching on the roof. This was hundreds of years ago. This was before electricity. They made their own clothes. They made their own soap. They hunted their food. They grew their vegetables. These were difficult times, but they filled the days quite easily with all of the work. Well, one night, as Mabel and her family were gathered around the hearth, and if you don't know what a hearth is, it's the fireplace. It's the center of these homes where, in those days, in those homes, people wouldn't sleep in separate bedrooms. They would all sleep around the fire because that's how they stayed warm. Well, one evening, one cold, December evening. Mabel and her brothers and sisters and her parents, they had just had a delicious meal. They made a delicious stew of vegetables and other various meats that they had just sort of curing and laying around their humble home. And their bellies were full. They were settling down for the evening, and her father, whose name was Arthur, gathered all the children around to tell them a story. Well, as he was talking, a gust of wind came through the house and blew the fire out. And immediately, a chill descended on their home. And Mabel looked at her father and said, "Papa, what are we going to do?"
In this village, every home had a hearth like the one that Mabel had. And the plan was always, if one fire went out, one would go to the next home with a stick or a bit of straw and ask for a bit of fire to take back to their home. And as long as it wasn't a windy night or a rainy night, this was fairly easy, as the homes were pretty close together and the neighbors were close as well. And so Arthur knew what to do and comforted his family, in particular Mabel, who was a little concerned, and said, "I'll just go and get a bit more fire and bring it right back." So Mabel sat for a moment as her father prepared himself to leave their home, and then thought, and then said, "Papa, can I come with you?" And her father looked at her, and Mabel was quite small and young and really not quite prepared to go out into the cold of the night, but he could also see that Mabel was learning to become responsible and wanted to be a part of the activities of the home. And so he said, "Take my cloak, the one that's over in the corner, wrap it around yourself, and we'll go." So Arthur went and wrapped a different coat around his own shoulders, and Mabel went to the corner and laid her hands on her father's cloak. And this cloak, it felt cold to the touch, and it was heavy when she lifted it, but as soon as she put it around her shoulders and felt the weight of it, it immediately started to warm her up. It was a mix of furs, little bits of things that her father had collected over the years in his hunts. And immediately she felt a sense of pride that she got to wear it, and excitement because she was about to help. And any worry that she felt about being chilly or her family perhaps suffering in the cold was balanced out by that excitement because she knew she could do something about it, especially with her papa's help. So he waited for her by the door as she got herself situated and walked across the room. And she looked at Mama, who was cradling her little brother at the time, and she saw in the darkness, as the fire was the only light that they had, that Mama looked both a little concerned and also a little proud, and that matched her own feelings. And so, knowing that she was going to help Papa bring warmth and light back into their home, she put her shoulders up and walked across the room. As she got to her Papa and looked up at him, he looked down at her, giving a little nod to ask if she was ready, and she nodded back, yes. And he quickly opened the door, put his hand on her shoulder, and guided them out into the cold.
And once outside, that cold hit their faces immediately. It stung. Her eyes began to water, but she popped the collar up on Papa's cloak, which was really doing a good job insulating the rest of her, and she covered her mouth with it. And she looked up at her Papa, and he looked down at her and gave her a look like, "It's okay if you want to stay inside. I can do this on my own." But the look that she shot him back told him that she was going to soldier on. She was a tough, tough kid, and nothing was going to stop her from helping her Papa get that fire going again. So they started walking, and snow began to fall. And it was light, big flakes of snow. And it was beautiful the way it shot across the moonlight. And they walked, their breath making clouds in the air as they walked. And they walked, and they walked. And the nearest house was about a half a mile. And as they approached it, they couldn't see a glow coming from any of the windows. And so they were concerned. Arthur was concerned. And he said to Mabel, Mabel, maybe we should try the other house that's just a little bit further. And she said, no, Papa, maybe they need help. Maybe their fire went out and maybe we can help them. And he said, well, we have to help ourselves. Mabel, we have our family to look after. She said, well, we can do both. We can look after ourselves and we can look after others. This is not a zero-sum game, Dad. And he said, okay, Mabel, I really appreciate your spirit. We'll check in on them and we'll see what the situation is with their fire, and if they need help, maybe we can help them. So they arrived at the dark house and they knocked on the door, and they knew the people that lived there. These were the McGregors, and they had lived there for years. And they knocked and they knocked. And finally the door opened, and it was old lady McGregor, and she looked panicked. And Arthur said, Old Lady McGregor, because that's what everybody called her. She had a name, but no one knew it. He said, Old Lady McGregor, is everything okay? We noticed that your fire's not going, and ours isn't either, so we're out looking for fire. Do you need help? And she said, oh, it's my husband, Old Man McGregor. He's sleeping, and he just won't wake up. And Mabel got very scared. And she said, no, he's alive. He just does this. He's a very deep sleeper. And I'm too old and frail to walk for fire. And our fire went out, and I can't get him to budge. It's like trying to wake a rock or some other inanimate object. And Arthur said, well, is he going to wake up anytime soon? I mean, is this normal? Does this happen? And she said, yeah, it does. But, this is pretty bad timing because the snow's coming. It's pretty cold, and I'm old and frail, and I need some warmth. So Arthur looked at Mabel, and Mabel looked at Arthur, and they said, okay, Old Lady McGregor, we're going to help you. We're going to go to the Connollys and check out their fire situation, and we'll get back to you. And so they hoofed it off to the Connollys. And as they approached the Connollys, they could see the red and orange glow from a warm hearth. And they knocked on the Connollys' door.
Mr. Connolly answered the door, warm and glowing, and he saw his two neighbors who looked a bit distressed and said, what's happening? And they said, we've lost our fire. The wind blew it out, and then when we went to the McGregor's home, their fire had gone out as well. We were wondering if we could get a bit of your fire to take to them and to take home with us. And Mr. Connolly looked back towards his wife, and Mrs. Connolly looked towards him with an interesting, knowing look. And he said, come in, I have something to tell you. So Mabel and Arthur looked at each other for a moment and very gratefully stepped inside where it was warm and the fire was glowing on them all. And as they passed Mr. Connolly, they noticed that he had a bit of snow still on his shoulders as if he'd been outside. And he turned to them as he was closing the door and said, please have a seat by the fire, get warm. My story's short, but it's important. So they sat by the fire, and Mrs. Connolly reached to the side and poured them a bit of the warm apple cider type drink that she was keeping hanging in a pot over the hearth. She gave each of them a little mug of it. They gratefully accepted, warmed their chilly fingers on the mugs. And Mr. Connolly sat down next to his wife, leaned against her shoulder and said, our fire went out too. Mabel and Arthur looked to each other because one house with a fire going out is one thing. 2 houses is a bit curious, but 3 on the same night tells you that something is going on. And Mr. Connolly said, I was looking all over It's funny, had I left at a different time, I might have met you out in the snow, but I turned the opposite direction. I began looking for a home that had that glow that would tell me that their fire was lit. The first home I came to, I expected to see it, but didn't. And the second home, I expected to see it and didn't. And I kept going until in the snow, I saw what looked like maybe a deer. But as I got closer to it and it got closer to me, I saw it was too tall to be a deer. It had antlers and it had what looked like brown fur. But then the face looked more like a person. And as they got closer, I couldn't quite tell if this person was a man or a woman. I couldn't tell if they were young or if they were old. I couldn't tell who they were or where they were from. But somehow they just felt like they knew something. And because I didn't quite recognize them, I didn't want to go too close, so I called out in the snow, "Who are you?" And they called back, "Who are you?" And so I said, "I'm Connolly. I am from the family of Connollys, and I'm looking for fire." And the person just nodded and said, "I know." And now Mr. Connolly wondered, how could this person know? I've never seen them. They can't know me, so how can they know what's happening in my house? And they said, "Your neighbor's fires are out as well. Is that right?" And he said, "Yes." And they said, "Did you stop to see if they needed fire too?" And he said, "Well, I knew they needed fire because they didn't have it, but no, I didn't stop." And then this person or being, this someone said, "Perhaps you should try. Perhaps it would change something." And he looked down at the ground, at the snowy ground beneath him and thought, why didn't I check? Perhaps I could have brought some comfort to the people along the way and at least let them know that I was out trying to help, or maybe I could have found out that one of them was also out looking for fire and I could have joined them. Why didn't I think of this? And feeling a little bit ashamed, he looked up, but the someone was gone. And so he started to wonder what he'd just seen and to feel that sense of regret that he hadn't even tried to see how his neighbors were. And in his heart, he knew he had to do something different. So he turned around quickly and went to check on the last one he'd seen. And indeed, they were cold and needed fire, but the whole household had the flu or some sort of illness and they really couldn't get up. And he just thought, wow, if I'd known, maybe I could have told them, look, I'm doing this, because they definitely seemed scared. And he said, I'm gonna work on this. I'll find out what to do. Please wait. And they were really comforted by his visit. And so then he went to the next house and reassured them that he would figure something out. And then he started to come back to his house. And he just had a feeling that maybe someone was watching. And he turned around, and there again in the snow was the someone. And even though he couldn't quite see their face, he seemed to see that they were smiling a little. And they said, that's the spirit. And then as he blinked, they were gone. And he turned back to his house. And he could see suddenly that it began to glow. So he walked back and joined his wife, who said it was just like magic. The fire started on its own, and it was already toasty when he got in. And he was telling her about the someone he met in the snow when there was a knock on the door. And so he looked at Mabel and Arthur, and he said, what do you think that meant? That's the spirit. And Mabel looked up to Arthur, and Arthur looked down to Mabel and said, I think I know. And I have a feeling that we won't be needing to take any of your fire with us tonight. And Mabel knew why. Because in her heart, she had a feeling that even by checking in on her neighbor, something might have changed, something might have warmed. And just to be safe, they did take a bit of fire with them. And they did what they would do in this little village. They made a little torch and a little something to shield it from the wind. and it lit their way as they walked past their neighbor's home that was already lit up, and looked in the little window and waved to them as the neighbor waved back appreciatively as she rubbed her sleeping husband's cold feet. And then as they got back to their home, there was Mama and baby brother sitting by a fire. They opened the door and came in with their little torch. And Mama said, "I'm so glad you're back. You won't believe what happened." And Mabel looked up to Arthur, and Arthur looked down to Mabel. And they looked at Mama, and Mabel said, "I'll believe." The end.
Parisa, are you ready for one more story?
I'm thrilled to try.
All right. The word is candy cane.
Once upon a time, there was a little boy named Thomas who lived in a little fishing village in Jamaica. Thomas loved to swim. Thomas loved to run. Thomas loved to care for his chickens. But most of all, Thomas loved candy. Now, eating candy isn't necessarily a pastime, but Thomas could have made it one. The thing is, it wasn't just that he loved eating candy. He loved the idea of candy itself. He loved the idea of sweetness. He loved the idea that somewhere, someone tried to make sweetness into something that someone else could have. You could give it to someone. You could give it to yourself. You could put it in your lunchbox. You could put it on a shelf. But that there is this way of encapsulating sweetness, putting it into a little container that meant that anyone could have it. And that just delighted Thomas. So the thing is, Thomas lived in a place where, although he had so many of the riches of life, wonderful parents, a funny and sometimes frustrating but pretty cool sister, he loved his teachers, and he loved school, and he loved being able to lie on his back on the dock at the end of town, where the fishermen would come in on their boats at night, and where if he was up very early in the morning, he would see them going out. He would lie on his back, and he would think about the things that he loved. Nowadays, we call that a gratitude practice. But this was a long time ago, and Thomas had never heard of such a thing. He just knew somehow that being thankful for things made life all the sweeter. So he was lying on his back one late December and smelling the baking that was going on in town. And in Jamaica, around the holidays, there are these beautiful cakes and puddings and things that are made with candied fruits and spices, cinnamon and allspice and nutmeg and ginger. He is lying on his back on this dock, feeling the rough wood beneath his bare skin, his feet warm against it, kind of waving his knees back and forth, watching his shorts sway side to side, and smelling the beautiful smells of the baking going on around him. All of the Christmas cakes and pies and puddings with all their dried fruit and allspice and ginger and cinnamon. Just loving the smell of the sweetness on the air as it mingled with the smell of the fresh sea. And he thought, it's probably time to go back home. It's getting a bit late. So he jumped up, and his feet thumped down this dock, feeling the sturdiness even as it moved a little bit under him. And he walked toward his little village, kind of following the trail of these beautiful smells coming out of everybody's homes as they prepared for Christmas lunches and dinners and visits to friends. And as he walked, he saw the shop owner, Mr. Andrews, putting something up outside. It was a cut-out picture of a cane, but not a cane that he'd ever seen before. This one was white and red, alternating, as if perhaps a white cane had red ribbon wrapped around it, or a red cane had white ribbon wrapped around it. And he thought, why on earth is Mr. Andrews putting that out there? He's a shop owner and he sells different foods and things. I didn't know he sold canes too. So, being a curious boy, he walked over and said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Andrews." And Mr. Andrews said, "Good afternoon, Thomas." And Thomas said, "What is that cane? Is that something you're going to sell now?" And Mr. Andrews said, "It's something I am selling now, but it's not the cane you might think it is. It's a special kind of cane." Thomas said, "A special kind of cane? Like a sugar cane?" And Mr. Andrews said, "Well, in a way, but also not like the cane you know, the sugar cane or the walking cane. Come inside and I'll show you." So Thomas looked down at his bare feet, and then Mr. Andrews did as well. And then he said, "Don't worry, you don't need shoes here. Come inside." So Thomas walked after him and walked into the store that was filled with the spices and dried fish and dehydrated milk and the different things that the shop sold. And he loved being in the store. Usually he went with his mother after church. That's not true. It wouldn't be open on a Sunday. Usually he went with his mother after school when he had his shoes on and his school uniform. But now he was in his hanging out clothes, and still Mr. Andrews welcomed him in, and being there by himself made it a very different experience. He was able to look at things in a different way. And he looked around and actually lost Mr. Andrews for a moment, because Mr. Andrews was bending below the counter at the back of the store. And when he stood up, Thomas saw him holding a tiny version of the cane that he'd seen Mr. Andrews hanging outside. Now this surprised Thomas. He had no idea to expect this to be so small. He had expected it to be perhaps as big as the one that was hanging outside, which was a good maybe 2.5 feet long. But it was little. And he walked up to Mr. Andrews and looked at it, and Mr. Andrews said, "This is a candy cane." Now, we know how Thomas feels about candy. He loves the idea of it, maybe even more than eating it itself. And he looked and he said, "Can I hold it?" And Mr. Andrews said, "Of course." So he handed it down. And to Thomas's surprise, it was hard and it smelled amazing. The smell of peppermint just rose up to his nose from it, and he couldn't believe what a magical little thing this was. And Mr. Andrews said, "Do you want to taste it?" Thomas's eyes lit up. Mr. Andrews said, "Go ahead. That one's yours." And Thomas hesitated because Mommy didn't get him candy. This wasn't a candy that he'd made. This was just a free candy, and he couldn't believe his great luck. Mr. Andrews said, "Make sure you tell other people, if you like it, that it's pretty great." And so Thomas gave it a lick, and oh boy, it was a little buttery, a little sweet, and had this beautiful peppermint taste to it. And he thought, "My goodness, I will tell them. I'll tell everyone how wonderful a candy cane is." And he looked at Mr. Andrews and he said, "Are there enough for everyone to have one?" And Mr. Andrews said, "Yes, there are." And Thomas thought, nothing would make me happier than if I could make sure that I gave one to everyone. He was afraid to say this out loud, but his heart, so in love with sweetness and sharing sweetness with other people, just wouldn't keep it in. And he said, "Mr. Andrews, I want everyone to have one of these." And Mr. Andrews said, "Everyone can come and get one." But Thomas said, "Not everyone can. I have this one, but I want my sister to have one, and Mommy, and my friends at school, and everyone around to have this. It's so wonderful." Mr. Andrews thought for a moment. Now, I won't tell you what Mr. Andrews was thinking because this is really Thomas's story, but there was definitely a process going on in his mind. He looked around his shop, and then Thomas looked around as well at all of the things that were Christmassy and really celebrating the season. And Thomas didn't know exactly what happened at the time, but he could guess at it later when he was a grown man and running the store himself. As Mr. Andrews looked around at all of the decorations, and something shifted in him. And he said, "Because of you, Thomas, everyone will have one. Tell everyone to come and get one from me as a present for Christmas. I want everyone to have some sweetness." And Thomas was so happy to do it. He walked around and then eventually started running around town and telling everyone that Mr. Andrews had these candy canes for Christmas and everyone could have one. And he joyfully took his home and decided to save it. And every day took a little look with a little gratitude on that dock and thought how wonderful it was that he wasn't the only one experiencing something so sweet. The end.